son-in-law was the one who suggested we get my wife a home security camera, said it would help her feel safer while I was at my woodworking class on Tuesday mornings. That was 8 months ago. Last Thursday, my daughter called me from her car, crying so hard I could barely understand her. She'd been checking the footage. "Dad," she finally managed, "you need to come home right now. And don't tell Robbie." Robbie, my son-in-law of 11 years. The man who'd given the toast at our 40th anniversary dinner. The man who called me every Father's Day without fail. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without knowing what the past 2 years looked like from the inside. My name is Leonard. Wait, no. My name is August. August Calloway, 67 years old, retired high school principal from Knoxville, Tennessee. My wife, Miriam, is 64. She was a pediatric nurse for 31 years, the kind of woman who remembered every patient's birthday and kept handwritten thank you notes in a shoebox under our bed. She was sharp. She was funny. She did the crossword in pen. The forgetting started small enough that I wrote it off as stress. She'd leave the stove on, lose her reading glasses, find them in the freezer. She forgot the name of a neighbor we'd known for 15 years. I told myself we were just getting older. 64 isn't ancient, but it isn't young either, and I'd been reading enough about aging that I could explain away almost anything. But then she forgot our son. Not completely. Not like she looked at a stranger. But we were sitting at Sunday dinner, and she turned to me in the middle of passing the rolls and said, "Who does he remind you of?" About our own boy Garrett. He was sitting 3 feet away. Garrett caught my eye across the table and neither of us said a word, but I saw something close in his face that I'd never seen before, like a door shutting quietly. After that, I started paying attention differently. Robbie had been around constantly by then. He and my daughter, Lena, lived 40 minutes away in Maryville, and at some point in the previous year, Robbie had started showing up midweek, bringing groceries, helping Miriam with her medications. He'd gotten laid off from his project management job the previous spring and was doing consulting work from home, he said, which seemed to mean he had a lot of free time. I was still doing part-time consulting for a school district over in Oak Ridge 3 days a week. Robbie stepped in and I let him. Because what else do you do when your son-in-law offers and your wife is struggling and you're exhausted from trying to hold everything together alone? He was good at it. That's what made it so easy to miss. He organized Miriam's medication schedule into a laminated chart he kept on the refrigerator. He drove her to appointments when I couldn't get away. He cooked dinner twice a week and always stayed to eat with us, easy and comfortable in our kitchen, knowing where every pot was kept. Lena would join when she could get off work. She's a physical therapist, busy schedule, and those evenings felt like the family pulling together the way families are supposed to. The problem was the money conversations. They started maybe 10 months after Miriam's symptoms appeared, subtle enough that I almost didn't notice them accumulating. Robbie would mention over dinner that he'd read an article about memory care facilities in the area. "Just so you know what's out there," he'd say. Or he'd bring up a neighbor whose elderly parents had needed to liquidate assets for medical expenses and weren't prepared. "You guys are in good shape," he'd say, glancing around our kitchen in a way I couldn't quite read, but it's worth thinking about. Once, he asked to see the deed to our house, said he was helping a friend navigate a property issue and wanted to compare the format. I pulled it out and handed it to him without a second thought. I was 66 and tired, and I trusted him completely. I didn't understand what I was looking at yet. The night everything changed, I wasn't even supposed to be home. My woodworking class had been cancelled. The instructor had a family emergency, and I came through the back door around 7:30 to find Robbie alone in our kitchen. Miriam was in the living room watching television, which was normal. What wasn't normal was Robbie standing at the counter with Miriam's pill organizer open, holding a small unlabeled bottle I'd never seen before, tipping something into the Thursday compartment. He heard me and turned fast. Smiled. "Hey, August, didn't hear you come in." He capped the bottle and slipped it into his jacket pocket in one motion, smooth enough that if I'd blinked, I'd have missed it. "Class, get out early." "Cancelled," I said. My voice came out even. "I don't know how." Shame. You want some coffee? I just made a pot. I said sure. I sat down. We talked about a Tennessee football game for 20 minutes and I watched his face the whole time and he never flinched once. That night, after Robbie left and Miriam was asleep, I sat in the kitchen for 2 hours. I was a high school principal for 22 years. I've looked a lot of teenagers in the face while they lied to me, and I know what practiced calm looks like. Robbie's smile when he turned around had been practiced. I didn't sleep. By 4 in the morning, I'd made a decision. The next day, while Robbie was at a client meeting and Miriam was resting, I called my daughter. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. I just asked, as casually as I could manage, whether she knew what was in the unlabeled bottle Robbie kept in his jacket. Silence on the other end of the line. "What bottle?" she said. That was when I understood she didn't know. I drove to the public library on Clinch Avenue. I know it sounds strange, a 67-year-old man going to the library to research his son-in-law, but I needed to think somewhere that wasn't my house. I asked the reference librarian, a quiet man named Pete who'd helped me research local history years ago, whether he could help me find information on medications that could cause dementia-like symptoms in older adults. He looked at me over his glasses for a moment, then pulled up a chair. What we found over the next hour scared me more than I'd expected. There are sedative compounds, some of them not even intended for human use, that in small regular doses can cause confusion, memory loss, and cognitive decline in elderly patients that is virtually indistinguishable from early-stage Alzheimer's. The effects are dose-dependent. More importantly, they're reversible, if caught early enough. One study we found noted that patients showed significant cognitive improvement within 48 to 72 hours of discontinuing the substance. Pete didn't ask me who I was researching. He just printed everything and handed me the stack without a word. I drove home with the weight of it sitting in my chest like a stone. There were 2 things I needed to do before I did anything else. First, I needed to know whether Miriam's symptoms would change if she stopped getting whatever was in that bottle. Second, I needed proof I wasn't inventing this. The camera had been Robbie's idea. That irony still keeps me up at night sometimes. It was one of those small indoor cameras mounted near the kitchen window, pointed roughly at the counter where Miriam's medications sat. Robbie had installed it himself. He'd shown me the app on my phone and walked me through how to pull up the footage. The recording went back 30 days. I sat in my truck in the driveway and watched 30 days of video on a 4-inch screen. Robbie was on the footage 11 times. 6 of those times he was alone in the kitchen with Miriam's pill organizer, and every single time he added something from that small unlabeled bottle before putting it away in his jacket. I recorded the screen with my cell phone. Shaky footage, poor quality. But it was there. I called my neighbor Archie, who'd retired from the Knox County Sheriff's Department 6 years ago and still had connections. We'd been friends for 20 years. I asked if I could come over. Archie watched the footage on my phone without saying anything. Then he set the phone down on his kitchen table and looked at me with the expression of someone who knows exactly what they're looking at. "You need to talk to someone at the department," he said. "Tonight. I need to know what he's giving her first." August. He said my name the way a man says it when he wants you to hear him. "This is evidence of a crime. You need to stop handling this yourself right now and let people who know what to do take over." I told him about replacing the pills. I'd done it the morning after I saw Robbie at the counter, emptied the Thursday and Friday compartments, and replaced whatever was in them with similar-looking vitamins from a bottle in the medicine cabinet. I needed to see if Miriam changed. Archie put his hand over his eyes. "Did she change?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "She did." It had started the morning after. Miriam slept later than usual. Then came downstairs and made herself breakfast. Eggs, toast, the whole thing, before I was even out of the shower. She'd been letting me make breakfast for months. I stood in the kitchen doorway watching her move around the stove with a kind of ease I hadn't seen in a year. And I didn't say a single word because I was afraid if I said something it would break whatever was happening. By the second morning she'd finished a novel she'd started 8 months ago and abandoned. She told me about it at dinner. The characters, the ending, what she thought of the writing. She talked for 20 minutes straight without losing a thread once. I sat across from her and nodded and kept my face neutral because I was so afraid of what I was feeling. By the third morning, she found me in the garage and said, "August, something has been wrong with me. Hasn't it? Something real." It wasn't a question. I felt it like being underwater, like I could see you but couldn't reach you. Her voice broke on the last sentence. I kept trying to remember things and they just slipped, like trying to hold water. I told her I needed a few more days before I could explain. I asked her to trust me. She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "Okay, Miriam has always trusted me. That's the thing about a 43-year marriage. You build something between you that holds even when you can't explain why it should." Archie came with me to the Knox County Sheriff's Department that evening. We spoke to a detective named, well, he introduced himself as Detective Pierce, mid-40s. The kind of man who writes everything down in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil and asks follow-up questions before you've finished talking. He watched the footage. He looked at the photos I'd taken of the unlabeled bottle before I replaced the pills. He listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Mr. Calloway, I need to ask you something directly. Your son-in-law installed this camera. Is it possible he knew it was recording?" I thought about it. The camera was angled toward the window, not the counter. Robbie had set it up to capture the backyard, he'd said, in case anyone tried the back door. He'd never mentioned the counter. The angle was coincidental. You could only see the medication area clearly if you were deliberately looking for it. "I don't think he knew," I said. "All right." Detective Pierce wrote something in his notebook. Here's what happens next. What happened next was a week I don't fully want to relive. We had Miriam's blood drawn at the University of Tennessee Medical Center. Comprehensive toxicology panel. The doctor who reviewed the results called me at home and said, in a very careful voice, that her blood work showed levels of a sedative compound consistent with regular low-dose administration over an extended period. He said, in someone her age, this level of exposure over the duration we're estimating would produce exactly the symptoms you've described. He paused. "Mr. Calloway, your wife should make a full recovery." I had to put the phone down for a minute. Garrett flew in from Denver the following Tuesday. He's 39, works in commercial real estate, steady under pressure most of the time. He arrived at our house looking like he'd aged 5 years on the plane. I met him at the door and handed him the medical report without saying anything, and he stood in the hallway and read it twice. "Does Lena know?" he said. "Not yet." He nodded. He sat down at the kitchen table. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Dad, why? What was he getting out of it?" That was the part I'd been turning over for a week. Robbie's finances, as I learned from Archie's contacts and eventually from the investigators, was significantly worse than anyone in our family had known. He hadn't been laid off. He'd been quietly let go after an internal audit found discrepancies in project accounts. Nothing formally charged, but enough that his field was effectively closed to him. The consulting work was real but barely generating income. He had $119,000 in personal debt, most of it gambling losses he'd hidden from Lena through a separate account she didn't know about. He was 6 months behind on their mortgage, and our house, in a neighborhood where property values had climbed steadily for 10 years, was worth just over $680,000. He hadn't approached a lawyer yet, but the investigators found a folder on his laptop labeled Guardianship Options that contained research on how to petition for financial guardianship of elderly individuals deemed cognitively incapable of managing their own affairs. There were notes, calculations, timelines. He'd been building a case. I had to tell Lena. That was the hardest conversation of my life, and I've had some hard ones. She came to the house on a Wednesday afternoon thinking it was just dinner. I sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where Robbie had eaten with us dozens of times, and I told her everything. I went through it in order, what I'd seen, what I'd researched, the footage, the blood tests, Robbie's financial records. She didn't cry at first. She sat very still and listened to all of it. When I finished, the first thing she said was, "Mom was getting better, and he kept going." That detail, that Miriam had shown signs of improvement at certain points over the past year, and that the dosing had continued anyway, was the one that had broken something in me too. There had been windows, moments when Miriam seemed clearer, more like herself. I'd noticed them and told myself I was imagining it, or that she was just having a good day. Now I understood why those windows had closed again. Lena cried then. She cried for a long time, sitting at that kitchen table, and I sat with her and didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. Robbie was arrested on a Friday morning. He came to the house the way he always did on Fridays, with a bag of groceries from Kroger and a cheerfulness that I now understood as performance. He let himself in with his key. Miriam was in the garden. I was in the living room. Detective Pierce and 2 officers were parked down the block. Robbie set the groceries on the counter and called out for Miriam and then looked at me and said, "You all right, August? You seem quiet." I said, "I'm fine." He started to put a loaf of bread in the cabinet and there was a knock at the door. What happened in the next 2 minutes I will remember for the rest of my life. Not because it was dramatic, although it was. Because of Robbie's face. He turned when Detective Pierce identified himself, and for just a fraction of a second, not even a full second, I saw something move across his face that wasn't panic and wasn't guilt. It was something older and more exhausted than either of those things. Like a man who has been waiting for a knock at the door for a long time and is almost relieved it finally came. Then it was gone and you were saying, "This is a misunderstanding." And Detective Pierce was reading him his rights, and Lena, who had been waiting in the hallway, walked out and looked at her husband in handcuffs and didn't say a word. Miriam came in from the garden when she heard voices. She stood in the kitchen doorway with dirt on her gardening gloves, looking at her son-in-law being handcuffed at our kitchen counter. I went to her and took her hand, and she held on hard. "August," she said quietly, just my name. "I know," I said. The trial was scheduled for March in Knox County Criminal Court. The charges were elder abuse, fraud, and criminal poisoning under Tennessee law. The DA was considering an aggravated assault charge depending on how the medical testimony developed. Robbie's attorney, a sharp woman from Nashville who'd driven up specifically for this case, tried to frame the whole thing as a misunderstanding. A well-meaning caregiver who'd given Miriam herbal supplements he'd read about online and hadn't understood the risks. The argument collapsed on cross-examination when the prosecutor walked Dr. Ellen Marsh, the toxicologist from UT Medical, through the dosage levels and duration, and asked whether accidental oversupplementation could produce those results. Dr. Marsh said, "No. This is consistent with deliberate, calculated administration over a period of approximately 18 months. When the financial records came in, the gambling debts, the hidden account, the guardianship options folder, the attorney's strategy had nowhere left to go." Robbie didn't take the stand. On the 3rd day of trial, during a recess, he told his attorney he wanted to change his plea. He stood up in that courtroom in a blue suit he'd had for years, the same one he'd worn to our anniversary dinner, and he said, "I did what they said I did. I knew it was wrong and I kept doing it." He didn't look at me. He looked at Lena. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't matter. But I need you to know that every time I told myself I'd stop, I meant it. I couldn't figure out how to stop." Lena looked back at him without any expression at all. That was the hardest thing I've ever watched my daughter do. The judge sentenced Robbie to 9 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Full restitution for Miriam's medical expenses and legal fees. Permanent restraining order. The gavel came down and Miriam reached over and took my hand and didn't let go until they'd led him out of the courtroom. That was 7 months ago. Things are not the same. They won't ever be exactly the same. Lena is in the middle of a divorce, living in an apartment in Maryville closer to work, and she and Miriam have dinner together every Thursday. There's still something fragile in those evenings, something that wasn't fragile before. We're careful around the edges, but Miriam is back. She's volunteering 2 mornings a week at the pediatric unit at East Tennessee Children's Hospital, not nursing, just reading to kids, And she comes home from those mornings with a lightness I recognized from the first years of our marriage, from before the kids, from the version of her I fell in love with in a university library in 1981. She's growing tomatoes in the backyard. She's sleeping well. Last month she beat me at Scrabble 3 weeks in a row and made sure I knew it. I retired completely in January. No more Oak Ridge contract. I told the district I was done, and I was, and I don't regret it. Garrett drove down from Denver for Easter, and the four of us, me, Miriam, Garrett, Lena, sat at the kitchen table and ate together for the first time since everything. It wasn't easy. There was a chair that nobody sat in. Garrett made a joke that didn't land and then apologized for making a joke, and then Miriam laughed at the apology, and somehow that unlocked something, and we ate dinner like a real family for 2 hours. After they'd gone and Miriam was upstairs, I sat alone at that table for a while. I thought about what I'd almost missed. 18 months of my wife disappearing and me telling myself it was just aging, just the passage of time, the natural order of things. I thought about how easy it is to explain away what you don't want to understand, not because you're foolish, because you're tired, and because the explanation that protects someone you love is always the one that feels most available. Archie stopped by the following Tuesday the way he does, and we sat on the back porch with a couple of bottles of Coke because neither of us drinks much anymore. He asked how things were going. I told him. "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said. "What?" "The camera was his idea." Archie nodded slowly. "People get comfortable," he said. "When something's working, they stop checking whether it's still protected. I've been speaking at a senior center in West Knoxville once a month on elder abuse warning signs, not as a victim, or not only as that, as someone who almost missed it. I talk about the signs I didn't recognize, the gradual expansion of one family member's control over medications, the slow exclusion of other family members from medical conversations, the financial questions that seem practical in isolation and predatory in context. I talk about trusting your instincts even when you love the person you're suspicious of, maybe especially then. The response every time is the same. People stay after. They come up quietly, 1 or 2 at a time, and tell me about their own parents, their own suspicions, things they've been afraid to say out loud. I listen to every one of them. Miriam came to the talk last month. She sat in the 3rd row. Afterwards, she found me at the refreshment table and handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You're getting better at this." "At what?" "Talking about hard things." She squeezed my hand. "You always went quiet when things got hard. I used to worry about that." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just held on to her hand. We walked out to the car together in the October evening. The kind of Tennessee fall that makes you believe the world might actually be all right. And for that particular moment, in the parking lot of a West Knoxville senior center, under a sky that had gone the color of a bruised peach behind the Smoky Mountains, it was. The greatest betrayals don't arrive with warning signs you can see from a distance. They come through the front door with a bag of groceries, calling your wife's name like they live there. They come from the people who know your house well enough to know where the pills are kept. Watch the pills. Watch who handles them, and when and whether they answer you straight when you ask. And if something tells you something is wrong, even when you can't explain it, even when the person you're suspicious of is someone you love, listen to that voice. I almost didn't. I came within 3 months of losing Miriam to a man who was counting on me being too trusting to look carefully at what was right in front of me. I looked. Not soon enough, but I looked. That had to be enough. And somehow it was.